it becomes harder and harder to keep all the pieces together, just to know that they're happening, not only in terms of technology and industries and companies, but also countries. Things used to be simple. There were a few large companies and developments, North America, Europe, and that was basically it. But not anymore today. And today you really have to understand the newspaper business, the publishing business, the TV, the internet, the high technology, the high tech, the telecom. It's just it's actually, I find this really exciting, but obviously specialization is the order of the day, and it is difficult to become a overarching generalist. The infrastructure has become more consolidated, but it's also kind of useful to remember that there was a time when these telecom or cable companies were essential monopolies in their own bailiwicks, in their own countries, state-operated monopolies. Then there was an opening, and now that we are in a phase of consolidation. The consolidation is partly based on the fact that these economies of scale are very high, and while there is room for competition, it's not that kind of wild, open competition that people had hoped for and envisioned. So we're probably moving into some oligopoly model, not a monopoly model, but an oligopoly model. Now, content, on the other hand, there the barriers of entry has actually declined, and so therefore we can have, like YouTube, lots of little suppliers of video or smaller channels, and that is kind of terrific. My expectation, though, is that that too will be temporary, that while there will be an enormous amount of that long tail of content, that people will mostly spend their time on very expensively produced materials, which will be produced by a handful of very large media companies around the world, but not a large number, nevertheless. Trust will become more important than ever because realistically, in that cacophony of voices and information and media that will inundate upon you, it is more likely that you will have to have brands, and the brands could be a Disney brand, it could be let's say a BBC brand, Canadian broadcasting type brands, something that people recognize and select. Similarly, editors, and I think will become more important than ever, because when everybody is a journalist, it's really as important to have some people who do the selecting for you. You go to that source. You don't want to know everything. You want to know what some people whose judgment you trust have selected for you. The technology is moving along at progressing at Moore's law speed, which is enormous. But the policy environment clearly cannot keep up with that in any form or shape. If anything, it slows down beyond its slowness already of the past because of the greater complexity and interactivity of elements. Telecom was one box silo, and let's say television was another, but it was within a nation. Now it is within a European Union, kind of a worldwide, and they interact with each other. Cultural sensitivities have not disappeared. New issues of threats, such as to children or to morals, have not disappeared. Each country has its own set of sensitivities. Germans about the historic past, Americans about, let's say, sexual matters, Europeans maybe about violence. And so these cultural preferences now have to be somehow dealt with in this kind of much more complex technology in an international environment. This is very, very difficult. The pressures to regulate will be large and frequently justified. That is, there was the early model of the internet was very libertarian, but even the internet community, to the extent that one can clearly identify what that means, has kind of reneged on its own libertarianism. They do seek a regulation of certain issues that they see as kind of harmful. Net neutrality would be an example. And so in that sense, everybody is looking for some regulation. Different countries will have their own priorities, just because communications goes digital over internet type arrangements doesn't mean that the policy preferences that were handled through broadcast regulation are going to disappear in favor of a free-for-all. So there will be national regulation, and China will do it its own way, and so will France, and so will Saudi Arabia. It is true that that it is hard to do so, but the Chinese have shown, which was totally predictable to me, and I've written about it for kind of easily 20 years, that the internet actually can be regulated because, in contrast to other media, the packets of information that constitute internet traffic are identifiable by sender and receiver. And therefore, you can actually kind of micro-target regulation in a very fine-tuned way, in a technical sense, more than before. Now, of course, you can find ways around it, but those ways require some sophistication and in some political situations, some risk. And in any event, regulation and rules don't have to be watertight and 100%. There are speed limits on highways, and nevertheless, of course, many people do drive above those speed limits. And so I think that the notion that the internet is inherently unregulable is not borne out by the technology or by the policy facts. We might kind of reach a future in which the present, that internet where everybody communicates, where things are relatively open and free, and where things are relatively cheap in a sense that information is free and available, will become a nice golden age of the past. It's not obvious that the future is more likely to be a lot of the content will become in some form monetized or advertising laden, and the openness will be partial in many societies. And so this has been a burst of innovation and creativity, and one hopes that it will continue and persist, but there are counterforces there, and those counterforces can be quite formidable. People would also be asking for regulations that protect them. So as often in this case, people don't quite recognize a certain kind of self-centeredness. They're kind of, you'd imagine, they think that they is just kind of the world. Their issues are most important, require most protection, and that otherwise they should be left alone. And so there's a kind of a notion is that government's role is to protect but not to restrict, but obviously you cannot do this for everybody. One person's protection is another person's restriction. That is probably one of the major problems here. The second problem is that governments are frequently now asked to help provide the infrastructure, particularly for costly areas or for reasons of technology and industrial competitiveness. So government is actually asked to play a role. And so as you would expect, in an information age, in an information economy, the highways, the means of communications will not be totally left to themselves. Where they don't operate in the way that society wants, government will step in. I think that's kind of unavoidable. Consumer protection is very important. There's a role for government to help this along. There's also a role for self-regulation in this field. There's a role for individual self-empowerment through tools of protection, blockage, opt-ins, and a variety of other means. That is true. But I think that with similar legitimacy, there's a role for policies that encourage the built-out and the innovation of the infrastructure in the same way that highways and airways and so on were built out, not often by private companies, but with government assistance support, because the positive spillovers to the entire economy transcend those of the individual profit-making activities. So I have no problems with imagining that around the world governments and societies come to a similar conclusion that infrastructure is too important to be left only to corporate investment. If it is on the distribution, we will kind of see enormously increased strength of pipes that can send you information, more powerful information, more cheaply. And so, and that is kind of an extraordinary societal, cultural development from the kilobit per second pipe system, as it were, just a few years ago, to the megabit, which we are now a factor of 1,000 more, to yet another factor of 1,000 more. And the implications of that are those kind of like of the kind of moving from walking or bicycling to automobiles and to private jet planes, as it were. It's extraordinary. But it means also that people will be using these media in kind of extraordinary new ways. So it's not just kind of more of the same, but there will be forms of communications that were impossible or impossibly expensive in the past. They will become commonplace media experiences, such as interactivity, immersiveness, 360 degrees, 3D, and just kind of an extraordinary richness of media that will be just mind-blowing in terms of its visual experiences. So when we go back, today's media will look like grainy old black and white silent movies of the past that have now been enriched to today. And if we can kind of imagine just another generation of enrichment, that will be how the future of media will look like. So this is very exciting.